Narda, are you with us? No. I think we're going to give Narda just another minute to come back online.
Actually, yes, I am here. It's just that I didn't find the button. The button. I am here, yes.
Okay, thank you. And let's see. Okay, so we'll slowly make a start as we're joined both by visitors with us on Zoom and visitors viewing this evening on YouTube, viewers through our website and also on Facebook Live. So thank you for being with us and also for all the guests this evening. So my name is Vivian Zichel, and I'm the Research and Program Managers with the institution formerly known as Vida David and very soon to be known as Kunstinstitut Melli. We're in a time of the in-between, which is going to be one of the things that we'll be touching on this evening. So this evening's program is a books event, which is one of the regular events that we host within Melli, which is sort of the virtual space that is behind me, which among other things is a bookshop. So for this special edition of books, we will be staging an online launch of the Errant Journal on the occasion of the first edition of the Errant Journal, which has the thematic title, When Are We? Which is quite appropriate for this evening's program because we're joined by guests across many time zones. We're joined by Irena de Kran, who is the founder and editor of the journal. We have with us the artist and researcher Raj Kamal Kalon, joining us from Berlin. Mark M. Smith, who is a researcher and historian from South Carolina, and architect, artist, and many things, I understand. Narda Alvarado joining us from Bolivia as well. So of course, this year that we're I take a deep breath as I say this, sort of like winding towards the end of, has been a year in which I think we've really encountered a renewed sense of time in its materiality. So time in many senses as a kind of an existential signifier, in qualities or senses of extreme urgency, time as an abyss, or indeed time as a sense of logistical duration. Certainly here at the organization, formerly known as Vida David, we've experienced high intensities of time, in particularly at the moment as we move between senses of time that were signified by the priorities of our prior colonial namesake, and to the time that will be signified our namesake coming up as we explore and discover what that is going to mean. So usually the books events unfold with only one guest and as a reading list. And that reading list sort of populates the bookshop that we have downstairs. As we move in and out of a lockdown, we've been experimenting with this program as well. So we will be stocking the Errant Journal, which we're very honored to also be advertising in its inaugural edition. But also when we met and discussed in advance, there was also a notion of opening up the kinds of references that might be part of a literacy of time. So we'll be discussing books, but also other kinds of references in terms of grappling with how to feel, sense, and interpret time, particularly in this year. So we'll be moving backwards and forwards. We'll also be welcoming questions and thoughts and responses at any point throughout the coming 90 minutes. And to kick off, I'd like to invite Irena de Kren, founder and editor of the Errant Journal, to first of all introduce the journal, but also to indeed share some of the references that framed this thematic, When Are We? So Irena, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Vivian. And thanks for Melly, formerly known as, for hosting this. And thank you for all the contributors also to join. I'll first explain a little bit the background, as we're all sort of in locations, nondescript locations and not together. I decided to put basically what we use as a proof print for the first issue as a background. So all the images you see are some of the images that are also in the journal. And if you get curious, then you can buy the journal. And some will also be referenced. Quite a lot are Raj Kamal's, but you will see that later in her talk. Yeah, I just thought to go into straight this topic of the first issue, because it also actually explains quite a lot of how I approach the journal. Although every issue will be a different thematic, I think it gives a good overview. To come to the title, When Are We? And the topic of the politics of time, I like to use a moment in 2017 in a museum in the city, a Brazilian city of Curitiba in the state of Paraná, where I went to it's a historical museum that is about the area of Paraná. And it is a museum that is chronologically ordered. So it starts with the sort of prehistoric flora and fauna and tools that they have found, and then goes in a sort of snake-like way actually into the basement also, chronologies to today. And there is an area in the museum that where sort of the European arrival starts, and from that moment it is mostly about the European influencing the area. And just before that, there was in a corner a display of baskets. Is also a picture. It's a very bad picture I took with my phone that is in the issue. It's a very simple display. And what interests me about this display is that there are some older baskets in the display, not that old, maybe 100 years, because they're made of natural material that doesn't last very long, but also of completely modern objects, because these baskets are still made today everywhere in Curitiba, in Brazil. They're from the Guarani and Gaikang indigenous people, and they make them today, and people buy them today and use them, and they're actually everywhere. So for me, it was very interesting how this very contemporary object was placed in a time before the European arrival, so before sort of the 17th century, in this case, of this area of Brazil, by using these modern objects. It is something that I could have realized before, but I realized it at that moment, in that time, because the contrast was so stark. And it made me start to think about how powerful the tool of this linear time is, and where you decide where something is in this linear time thing, in this linear time method, and what that means to how you place things in the now or in the past or even in the future. It's part of how the modern Western paradigm is based on progress, because we think in linearity, whereby progress or even the now and the new is always considered of more value than something in the past, in a way that we can even put something that is new in the past and therefore devaluing it. And we also constantly reinvent this new, and with it we also constantly devalue others. I also wanted to still, because it is the books program, have a few quotes from a book that I really like, that I actually started reading after Errant Journal went to print. But I just think it's such a good book that I don't want to steal people from it. It's this book, Potential History, Unlearning Imperialism. I actually found this also in my notes from Raj Kamal, but I came across it later. So I just want to give you a quote from Ariella Azoulay. As a principle, advancing implies a constant detachment from what must be made past, devalued and destroyed in the hope of what is expected to come in the future. Potential history's assumption is that progress is not just an idea, but more importantly, a destructive force, a movement, a condition embedded in temporal and spatial structures that in the course of a few hundred years has shaped the way we relate to the common world and narrate our modes of being together. We must not pretend we need to progress past progress. That is the temporal problem imperialism has devised for us. That's one. And then in my research to this politics of time, I started coming across many different ways of researchers before me having, of course, dealt with this problem. One is also Rolando Vasquez, very important. I also republished an essay in the journal. And another one is Johannes Fabian with his book Time and the Other, How Anthropology Makes Its Object, which is actually a classic that was published in 1983, where from the perspective of anthropology, he also described what he calls the denial of co-evilness. So how the other is made into an object in order to put that person into the past. Particularly, he was writing about how field work is done in the same temporal space with their subjects. And then when the anthropologist goes back home, writes it down, this shift happens between what was actually in the same space, both temporal and spatial, to make this divide. So those are two very interesting points of view in different ways, but it also happens in art. In art, we actually value the new and the now very much. We consider it, you know, this is something that also we constantly reinvent. And I have another quote by Azoulay that I really liked. It's a little bit longer, I hope you don't mind. The word art, as it emerged in the mid to late 18th century, was linked to the imperial conquest and mastery of time, as if time were not something shared in common, but a divisible thing to be allocated. The mastering of time is a key aspect of imperial violence that separates objects from people and places them in a progressive linear timeline, in which colonized people and colonizers occupy different positions and roles. Under a unified idea of art, this image could be concretized in and through accumulated and displayed art objects. Art became a way to avoid engaging with the world shared with others. It is now a field of expertise ruled by imperial principles that have little, if anything, to do with care for the shared world. Even the expansion of the term art was destructive because it led to a devaluation of many practices, practitioners, and objects now subjected to hierarchical dichotomies of high and low, primitive and modern, art and ethnography, art and artisanal, canonical and vernacular, masterpiece and craft, original and copy, authentic and touristic, and art and non-art. I hope I don't go on for too long. If I do, I'm sorry. So this is something that I wanted to do in this first issue and really also show how to retrieve, if I speak with Azoulay's wording, the potential history of other temporalities. So in the issue, different temporalities are touched upon. For instance, the temporality of the body by Sophie Hoyle, for instance, and Susan Butler, and also in some way with Mark. He will explain that later, that connection. Indigenous temporality, Narda's contribution does that, and perhaps also Rashida Phillips, the control of your own history and how history is written, and of course the temporal politics in museology, which brings it back to my museum, the moment in the museum where I had this realization. In relation to the pandemic, it's a difficult thing to answer how it actually relates to the pandemic, other than I think that the current pandemic magnifies the already existing inequalities. It's noticed by some people that our media are also ignoring countries that are actually doing very well in this pandemic, because and most of these countries are not considered modern. So this is also a way of how very apparent progress is denied because it doesn't follow the sort of narrative that we have of what is progress and what is modern. And of course, technology is also an important way that we deal with this crisis, but it's not something that is available. What is the most important thing for Errant Journal, however, is this sort of placing oneself in spatial and temporal space, and to realize that, you know, this is never universal, and then to position yourself. Because especially in the West, we tend to think that our experiences are universal. And in fact, our world is radically plural, including the ways we internalize and experience time.
So thank you for that introduction and for such a strong frame. And I'm so struck by this image of your encounter with the baskets as a moment at which a quality or a structure of time became immediately apprehensible or sensible to you. And it's sort of, it immediately makes me wonder or think back on earlier times in my life, and to sort of wonder when that became apparent to me, and something that I'd tempted to think about more. And it's something that I'd be interested to also ask to the other panelists as an open, or sort of a general question. If you do happen to have a recollection, if there was a moment or a cipher or an encounter that sort of that prompted a reflection similar to the one that Irena's shared with us, perhaps not. Before we move on to some of the other, your contributors and guests for the evening, and we'll be moving sort of in and out and backwards and forwards, I'm interested to ask, first of all, I mean, it's the first edition of the journal. It's a major undertaking as an independent practitioner to indeed move from potential to manifestation with a publication such as this. So I'm very interested to know why you felt this journal was needed in the Netherlands. Now, why you sort of poured your energy into making this thing happen?
This actually also comes from my practice of making exhibitions, and where I find it very more and more complicated how an exhibition works, because I have a longer interest. Like, I'm not only interested in art, actually, I'm interested in many different fields and many different ways of knowledge. But what happens in an exhibition space, or the white cube as we call it, is that it turns everything into art, also non-art objects. And in wanting to represent also sort of other voices, truly other voices, I didn't find the white cube a good medium, because it sort of unifies things, and it incorporates, or it eats it. It's like a machine that eats, you know, voices and then spits them out in the same sort of discourse. So I'm not saying that the publication is then the perfect format, or that it doesn't have its own problems, because of course it does. But I do feel it is a better format, for me at least at this time, to really include different voices in a way that they can still, or at least a little more, in my opinion, keep their own identity also. I kept the design with my fantastic designer, Jan-Pieter Karper, also as simple as possible. Also because it makes reading, in my opinion, more pleasant, but also for this reason, that we can really play around with it, and hopefully also in the future really exemplify the different voices and not sort of a format unifying them. I don't want unification, basically. I don't know if that answers your question. You're on mute, Vivian.
This unification of time zones is exactly the system that we sort of deal with when we come together in this Zoom platform and across time zones. So it's a good note. I mean, congratulations in general. It's a very exciting launch edition. It has many sort of friends, Remy Jungerman and Rolando Vazquez. So there's terrific contributors. And on that note, perhaps Narda, I could sort of pass to you. I mean, I almost want to open up with you with this question. Like, do you have any recollection, or is there anything that comes to mind in terms of a moment or a gesture that sort of brought to light what the encounter of, let's say, a linear governance of time is, and its rupture? I wonder if there is anything that comes to mind. If not, no worries, but I'd be interested to sort of start there.
Yes, I think actually part of my experience in this life and in this world is that whenever I travel, I feel very different. I recognize the kind of mindset I have as a Bolivian citizen and as a member of a society that is syncretic and disjointed. So actually, what I want to speak about today is about that. My my own empirical experience about how it feels to, let's say, to go to the north, and how different it feels to be there. Sometimes I feel very alienated, and I feel all this struggle, and at the same time I recognize myself in the north. So it is something that has to do with in a way it has to do with a different notion of time I might have, but it's very subtle. It's not, it is not something that I can even point to. I have to give many explanations to make myself understood. Is this yes.
And yeah, so it's something that you experience, yeah, as you say, as you've indicated, sort of deeply personally. But in terms of some of these references that we're opening up as literacies of time, did you have a reference that you wanted to contribute as well in opening up the conversation?
Well, yes, actually, I did prepare a small, like a PowerPoint presentation. So I don't know if this is the moment where I can present make my presentation.
Okay,
Or
so then
yes,
that we're gonna have to make a quick cut to our technical team to see if you can be enabled as a co-host, or you could email it to me. And oh no, you're a co-host. So if you hit share screen.
okay. So just to make myself clear, so how long do I have for this presentation, or is it more like a conversation?
We'll try to keep to a conversation as much as possible. So maybe similar to Irena, sort of 5 or 8 minutes, and
Oh,
link back in. So if you hit share screen,
okay,
is the green
okay,
button.
okay, perfect. So yes, I will share my PowerPoint actually. So I don't know if you can see it.
Yes, very well.
Yes. Okay. So this is what I prepared. I do believe that I have a different mindset than the Western one, and I had an experience when I was studying in Boston, and I went to this exhibition. I am an artist, so I went to this exhibition, and one of the artists was presenting this work. He was sitting on a desk, like in an office, and asking questions about time. And actually, I think he wanted to prove that there was only one way um to regard time, and his regard was Western. So I approached him and I said, well, listen, I know that I live in this part of the world when there is this different vision of time, and it is not Western. And our vision, well, it's not really our vision, but I explained him that there is this concept of Aymara culture, and we here in Bolivia we live with Aymaras. I don't want to use the word indigenous because I find it very problematic. I think it is a term that is used by ONG anthropologists. So I told him, okay, there is this concept, and this is the image. So there is this concept where, okay, it's here, called Kepnair, and it means that the past is in front of us because we can see it, and the future is behind because we cannot see it. And he was very surprised, but at the same time, it was difficult for him to accept that he was wrong. Because I told him, no, this is not the only way to see time. So there is this other way. And I remember this very clearly because it made me think for a long time about this conversation. Actually, he was, I thought he was going to be very interested in this, but he was not. So, okay, so after that, I made a work about inspired, let's say, in this concept, because I wanted also to understand myself, how it feels and what it means to have this mindset. So this is the kind of idea I can show visually. So this is how it feels. I have these two mindsets at the same time because I believe myself and I feel myself Western at the same time because I have Western education, and Bolivia is, as I have mentioned once in the paper or in the text that I wrote for Errant Journal, and we have many conflicts with with this phrase with Irene and the person who was in charge of editing my text, because this is the way I would like to define my society and the place where I come from, because this is my reality. We live in a pre-modern, modern, and postmodern society. So it is all these planes or these scenes of reality that take place at the same time. And I maybe for in the academic world, the world modern and especially pre-modern might sound politically incorrect, but I don't think it is, because this is the culture. I have these images so we can show in which ways, very literally and graphically, this is a pre-modern culture at the same time. So this is the market, and I go to this market, and we see people that this way of selling food that is coming directly from the producers to the buyers is very common. Bolivia, if I really welcome all of you to come one day and visit this country. It is we still have this kind of economical, social structure where everything is connected, and we are still living in this not idea, but this economical structure that comes from the past, of our productive structure. So this is part of my reality, and most of the people seen in this image speak Aymara or are Aymara descendants, and they do have this Kepnair culture embedded in their mindset. And it is not that it's so this is the past that we are looking at all the time. This is the past, but it is a past that at the same time is modern because it has been it is connected with the new economical structures and ways of being, because people here, they all have mobiles, they watch TV, they use internet. It's people, it's not indigenous, it's a postmodern Bolivian Aymaras, let's say. So this is another view of how the market is. And we also have supermarkets. But supermarkets took a long time to mm, to be part of our urban culture, because I think we have supermarkets for 20 years now, and there have been many intents to have supermarkets in the past, but for this reason, because this economical structure is very strong, it is based in, it's not dependent on the state. It is informal. Sellers do not pay taxes, and you don't get receipts. So it is the same. It comes from colonial times, this way of selling food. You can see it in many different countries. I'm not saying that Bolivia is the only country that has this kind of structure, but at the same time, and I am sorry for the picture, we do have, this could be Korea, this could be US, this could be Europe. This is postmodern, this is modern, this is the modern world. And there are also in all these levels, for example, I want to show this how the it is, people call it folkloric in a way to demean tradition, and I don't like to call it folkloric, but maybe that is the term we should use. uh, just to make myself clear, folklore is part of our daily life culture. So it is not folklore, it is artistic manifestations that are very different than contemporary art, and this might be one of the reasons why we have a very weak contemporary art scene, and I don't expect it to be stronger. I don't expect Bolivian contemporary art to be well known or to get international and to become part of the international scene, because it's like we are in different. It's like this is the way contemporary art thinks, and this is the way art works here, and it goes like this. It doesn't go like this. It goes like this. So it's kind of complex, and I hope these images are helping understand. So this is the architecture. It is new architecture. It's new Andean or new Aymara architecture, and it is based on a new economical system, new economical. Yes, it is a new system. It is like a mix of Aymara economical system and Bolivian system. So I want to show you how it looks from outside. Oh no, I don't have an image, but these kind of contractions are made for fiesta and for parties, because this is part of our culture. We like to party and fiesta and make fiestas constantly. And for people, this is more important than to having things that are important in Western mind. It's possible that people don't have. Maybe they don't invest in education, or they don't invest in buying cars or having uh, things at home that usually people want to have. Maybe they don't want to have money in the bank, but they want to put all their money in making this kind of architecture to have fiestas. And yes, well, we also, there are many times a year uh, in the streets of La Paz and other cities in Bolivia, most of our cities, there are all these festivals and celebrations. They are mostly pagan and religious, Catholic, religious, pagan, Aymara, Andean festivities that are very important for the entire population. So we are not so interested maybe in developing or being part of the capitalist system in that sense, but the way we think about the present is also important, because this is what I was also mentioning in the text I wrote. Our notion of future is very short. So the next celebration is setting our time. This means like so this is in January, this is in February, and we are expecting the celebration that comes in June. Then in June we are expecting the celebration that comes in maybe in August, then in December. We don't have an idea of the future, like in 10 or 20 years or 100 years. We don't have this idea. And I learned this when I was studying in the United States, that I had to ask my teacher, because they were talking about the future and I had no idea of what the future meant. And I had to raise my hand and say, excuse me, when is the future for you? Is it, were you talking about 1 year from now, 2 years, 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years? I had no idea.
I
And
I have to jump in. I find this so exciting because something that we're really digesting and reflecting a great deal in terms of the name change at the moment has been the phases of the name change and what has been necessary in order to go through that process. And we've sort of managed to understand that the first step was vulnerability, and to be to state and to understand that vulnerability needed to exist as a kind of a priority and a condition. And the next phase was learning, that vulnerability was a precondition for learning in terms of the unnaming itself. And then the third phase, we're looking for a word that is something like care, fun, joy, enjoyment, feeling, and the closest we can sort of get to is celebration. And I'm so excited or interested about a sense of time or a sense of futurity that is oriented around celebration, the next moment to celebrate, the next, that is the organizing principle of a time system.
yes, mostly for most Bolivians it is. Uh, and I don't know, but it is very, it's associated with happiness. And this might be a very strong statement I might be doing, but uh, um, I studied a bit like the mentality of my Aymara people, and I found out that it's possible that they don't get bored. So, and boredom is a very Western uh, sensation, feeling, understanding of things, because it also comes with reflection and self-reflection. I'm not saying that Aymaras don't self-reflect, but they might do it in a different way. And Bolivians too, in consequence, might not self-reflect equally. You know, it's like so things that are outside ourselves are more important. And in that sense, for example, nature is really important, and the idea of, it's not really supernatural things, but we do believe that there is more than what we see in reality. We people are very religious, not necessarily Christian, but like mixed. So there are many divinities. We cannot say that we are really polytheists, but at the same time, there is this all these Christian ideas of the world, and also Andean ideas that are connected to the earth, to the sun, to the moon, to stones. Stones have a lot of power here, and because it is an animist culture, so everything has life, even houses. You know, for the image I showed you, I'm sure that when the architect built this house, they put silver and gold papers, like colorful papers, underneath the structures. So this architecture has a spirit, has a soul, and when they say it, they really mean it. It's not something that it is embedded in the building. So it has a life, and everything has a life, even objects. For example, when, and with this I will finish, when you during the year in these celebrations, there is this specific ritual that we make, and my grandmother taught me, when it is called charear, which means like you are celebrating the objects and the things you have. So when you make this celebration, you speak to them with a loud voice, and you say, thank you. Let's say you have a new television or you have a new computer. So you talk to the computer and you say, "Hi, dear computer, I celebrate you, and I put you this kind of power, like because voice and the words we say, language, is a technology. It is used as a technology, and so we tell the computer, you have to work fine this year. Thank you very much for being my computer. You are, please make me do all the work that I have to do. Don't have any problems. And then you give this computer part of your energy. And it might sound crazy maybe for Western mind, but this is what we do. And it is normal for us to think in this way. And when you say this, you really mean it, and you don't make yourself believe that you are believing this. You just believe it. This is how I cannot explain that. And so yes, I guess that. And this is the clock that maybe you wanted to see, Irene, because this was the commission for the text. Irene was very interested in this clock, and this is it. For I don't know how I do believe that there are many connections in life, and that reality is always connecting things. When the pandemic came, Irene asked me to make this text based on this. I guess you see my entire screen, right? So this is the clock of the South, and it was implemented in 1214 in 2014 by two former governmental authorities. Actually, the guy of the idea is our vice president today. And this is the clock of the South. It means that the hands of the clock go counterclockwise. So whenever I go and I see it, I have to, make this click in my mind to make it shift. And the amazing thing is now I work in front, actually in the same square where this clock is. I don't know why or how this has happened, but my life is very close to this clock now. This is Plaza Murillo. This is the place where the clock is. And this image is I found it on the internet from 2018. And this is the National Museum of Art when I am working now. It's just in front of the clock. And this is what I see, and this is part of our past as well, our Western past. Every day I eat in front of this building. And this is the new, this is what is going to be behind the building of the clock. And when we were writing the text, when I was writing the text, I wanted to make an image without that building. So this is postmodern, this is capitalist, this is very strange form of socialist capitalist government we have now. And yes, this is, I think this image explains a lot.
And I'm sorry, I'm coming from like a place that's between Australia and the Netherlands. So the concept that a vice president would propose a clock going backwards as some kind of a statement is kind of amazing. So what was he proposing when he made this notion? Was it a polemical proposal? Was he proposing to speak back to the power of the North, or what was the discourse that this gesture was framed in?
Well, actually, there is this state project that has been that has been written in 2009. I don't know how it works in other countries, but it's possible that Bolivia is the first country in the world that has a decolonization minister. So the idea was to make Bolivians treasure our pluricultural cultural heritage. He wanted Bolivians to think about this notion of time that is part of our culture and way of regarding the world and reality. So it was not really controversial. I think many people accepted it, but of course there were people who were like against it. I like it, I love it, it represents a lot to me, but I don't think this clock changes our mentality. I don't think this clock decolonizes anything. It's just a symbol, it's just a gesture. So because to me, and this is how I would like to finish, is like the question for me is what it means what decolonization, I didn't write it down well, what decolonization really means to me. To me, it means that the Western world is not that I have to decolonize myself necessarily and only, but to, yes, I do have to. But to me, it means that the Western world should recognize where things come from. And for example, this is Potosi, and I actually chose this image because I think it is related to the Netherlands. Actually, there have been wars in the past because countries or the empires or the empires and were fighting for the silver that was coming from this territory. And this is what decolonization means to me. It means that we have that humanity has to be aware, has to be conscious of the history of, just as an example, of extractivism. Because Europe is very rich, US is very rich. There are other regions that are very rich, and they have a strong economical, political, everything power, and we do not. And this is unfair. And I know that in the Western mindset, it that the past is the past. We don't think about the past. Why should we think about the past? The future is what it counts. And I don't think that. The past is still very important, because this is the conversation we have. We don't have books here. We don't get books. How is that? Of course, I'm not saying that now, not even one book, but knowledge. We don't get the knowledge. Knowledge is difficult for us.
Thank you for this terrific contribution and set of references on the question. And it's a really great sort of definition that you offer of decolonization as a process by which a certain mindset recognizes where things come from. That's such a great working notion. And it reminds of the early moment in your presentation where you said there was this fellow that you encountered and you were trying to convey another sense of time and you couldn't find a sense of interest. You couldn't find that there was an interest to think the world or time sort of differently. So thank you again, Narada. I'll ask you to perhaps click off from sharing the screen at this point.
Yes, of course, of course.
Because I'll also then...
Okay, hold on. I don't get to find where it is. Do you see my struggle? I don't... Okay, hold on.
There's usually like a red thing up the top and it says...
Yes, I know. Stop share. Okay, yes. Yes, I hope so. Did I? Okay, thank you.
So, and also just a shout out if anyone wants to put in a Q&A at any point, we're on the webinar format, so that's entirely possible. And I will start sharing screen at the moment and invite for our next sort of set of references or contributions, Mark. If you could join at this point, this should come up. Sorry, that's different. We're gonna go slideshow. Yeah, here we are. So Mark, and please, yeah, I'd be interested. I'm not sure if this this idea of that came through Irena of like, if there are any moments at which an encounter with time became apparent as a place to begin, if that struck a chord or brought anything to mind for you.
For me, Vivian.
Yes, Mark, please.
Yeah. Well, in a way, what I'm going to tell you is kind of an origination story for me. And Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'll answer that in the course of unpacking this a little bit. I just want to thank Nada. That was very interesting, and you almost set me up too perfectly, really, because what I'm about to say has everything to do with the ownership of history, and that is a form of historical time and historical knowledge. And ultimately, I'm interested in the way that temporalities are used to reframe and write national narratives. So you're entirely right. If you don't have access to the past, then you really don't have much opportunity to challenge it. And my project here, which was really my first foray into American history, has everything to do with when are we? And the when is both the American South in 1860, where there are 3.8 million enslaved people, but also now. What I'm trying to do is connect the past, see how it's tethered to the future, and what that might tell us about the ownership of the past and how we narrate time. So Vivian, do you mind if I go on and answer your very good question by way of illustration of the larger points?
Take it away.
Okay. So I'm interested in the way that time is materialized, as Vivian said at the beginning, in particular, and how it's understood and mediated through the senses, right? So time doesn't just exist. It has to be apprehended and processed. And I'm very interested in the way that sound and time interact in a way to not just mark time, but use time. Not just seeing time, but using it as a resource to both really undermine and promote and fundamentally inform the nature of capitalism. I'm also interested in the way that time informs national memory and national identity. And I'm keenly interested in the way that racialized time locks those together. Okay, so my very brief talk is going to be about those topics, and I'm going to kind of focus on the idea and reality of the bell as a way to understand national time, memory, racialized time, and the connection between past and present. This image here is arguably the preeminent American image of emancipation, freedom, and liberty. This is the Liberty Bell, of course. And the Liberty Bell was held up as a mechanism for inclusion and universalization, really. And this comes from the first abolitionist journal, published in 1831 in the United States. Well, not the first, but one of the early ones. This is the first issue of the Liberator, which was run by William Lloyd Garrison out of Boston, interestingly, Nada. I'm sure he wasn't the person that you spoke to there, but it's the same kind of idea, right? And it says, proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. And this has become a very powerful American conceit about the nature of liberty. And so the Liberty Bell is held up as a kind of nostalgia, as a mechanism for embracing freedom. But I want to tell the understory of that. And at the same time that this is being promoted, a call for the emancipation of slaves, we have the reality of slavery itself. If we can go to the first or second slide, Vivian. Okay, so this is the connection between past and present. This is a plantation in South Carolina that exists today, just as it existed in 1860, just as it existed in 1830, when the Liberty Bell was promoted as an icon of emancipation. So what do we see here? What we see here is the pastoralization of slavery. We have a plantation house in the background, and in the foreground, in its very Edenic setting around flowers and trees, we have a bell. And the heritage and tourist industry in the United States, especially in the American South, really just elides the presence of this bell. It doesn't really talk about it. And it doesn't talk about it because fundamentally something like this bell feeds that American conceit about pastoralism, freedom, and what have you. If we can go to the next one, please, Vivian. Yeah, and again, we have a bell tower. In fact, the architecture of this is very clear. You know, it fits, it's very commensurate with the building itself. again, though, it's the machine in the garden, right? And it's soothing, it's palatable, and it's very southern. But fundamentally, what I'm interested in is what this really means. And what this really means is not at all pastoral or nostalgic. It has a very dark history to it. Because these bells were used to regulate slave labor. And they weren't just rung arbitrarily or capriciously. They were rung in accordance with the plantation owner's clock, the overseer's watch, and the only people on a plantation allowed to own watches who had access to clocks were the slave owners and the overseers. African American enslaved people were not allowed to own watches, were not granted access to time. So what you have here is not just the arrangement of labor on southern plantations. You have it, obviously there is arrangement of labor, and it's not capricious. I mean, it's not sun to sun. It's people are woken up to get to the fields by the sound of the bell, because time is owned and it's racialized. This is really the true history of the American South, and that plantations are really factories in the fields. We tend not to see that because this is the heritage industry on display here. This is what we see. But fundamentally, underwriting all of this was a very efficient exploitative capitalist system that tethered time to sound, and that's how bodies were arranged. That's how labor was exploited. It was as thoroughgoing as any industrial system in the 19th century world. I think our job as historians is to kind of peel away that conceit, to peel away that nostalgia, and to figure out what's really going on here in terms of time, sound, and the racialization of time. If the enslaved resisted this by perhaps running away, then the Liberty Bell itself was in fact attached to the enslaved body in an effort to betray any resistance to slavery. If we could go to the next one, Vivian, please. And here we have a bell that was attached to the body of an enslaved person who had been trying to run away. And what this really does is portray movement. So the bell is in actual fact the antithesis to liberty. It is the sound of slavery, and it controls the body in a very particular way. So how far have we come? What's been happening during the pandemic perhaps has given us some pause to think about the racialized nature of time and the use of African American labor. And I don't know if it's coincidence, but certainly something has happened this year in the United States in which this very question of time exploitation, the use of black bodies, has come to the fore in a very powerful way. And I think perhaps the best example I can think of that speaks to the principal themes of the Errant Journal is in the next slide. So this is a bell at Tulane University in New Orleans. And up until March this year, this bell stood very proudly on the campus of this very fine university. But precisely because we've been talking about the history of race in a meaningful and substantive way, there was some research put into this bell. And it turns out that this bell is the very kind of plantation bell that I showed you earlier in the first two slides. That this bell came from a plantation that was used to regulate, move, deny, exploit African American labor. And in light of that discovery, if we go to the next slide, Vivian, it's been taken down. And what you have then is a kind of ending of plantation time. But it could only end because there was a recognition that it existed. If we took the conceits of the heritage and tourist industry, we'd never really find that out. And I suppose one of the jobs of the historian is to really uncover and peel back some of these conceits that inform a national conversation about the desirability of emancipation, its particular meaning, what freedom means in the United States, and really uncover what the mechanisms for enslavement were. And I think we've come a little way in the teaching of that history. And I think this is a very powerful illustration, the absence of time perhaps telling us as much about the presence of time. There's lots more I could say. I think there's a whole history of patience woven in to this view of time, especially among the African American community. They've always been told to wait, to learn patience as a way to manage time. And I think what we're seeing in the United States this year is the end of patience. And I think this is deeply connected to the very history I've given you a quick unpacking of. And I think it's also just really revealing that the bell itself is a very multivalent image. Of course, the Liberty Bell is cracked, and that, I think, reflected the tendency between free wage labor north and an enslaved south. But it's also worth bearing in mind that bells were frequently melted down during times of war to be made into cannon. And then after the war had ended, the bells were reconstituted from the cannon into bells again. And I think there's a very powerful subtlety to that history, one largely unacknowledged, to be sure, but just because it's unacknowledged doesn't mean to say that it's not real and enduring. So that's my gesture towards this, trying to bring a little bit of American history to heal, I suppose.
Mm. Thank you. And that final image is one that certainly resonates for us very much at formerly known as Vidivit this year. It's interesting that we've sort of seen two references of monuments in terms of the significance of time and its organization. But indeed, you are a historian of the senses. And I just wondered about the quality of that sound of the bells, and if there's anything that is important to know or to consider about, what the quality of these bells are within the geography of the South and the particular resonance sonically or acoustically as well.
There's a lot going on there, isn't there? Because first of all, plantations were large places, and you had to be able to communicate time over great distances, which means you needed fairly large bells. They had to resonate. I don't think, in a way, that the bells are especially well made always. They're not really after harmony. I think they're after a kind of brute force of sound. And of course, the point about sound is that it's terribly transgressive. You have no earlids, you have to hear it. It punches its way into you. And it's quite a violent form of acoustomology. Mm. But I would also say that there is a kind of an aesthetic urban braiding of sound and bells in the Old South, because it did have its cities, and that aesthetic would be in the form of church bells, which, of course, since only the planters attended the prestigious churches, really kind of knitted together the social hierarchy of the South with whose bells were heard and whose voices were heard most obviously. So there is something to say about what the bells sounded like, but fundamentally, and I think this speaks to the very point that we're trying to make here, what it sounded like depended very much on who was doing the ringing and who was having to do the listening. So the very idea that time is a plurality is entirely correct, but just as the idea is, what does sound mean to you, was also highly pluralistic, because it had to be. Fundamentally, sound and time are used to mask or reveal asymmetries of power. And that's precisely what this was. I suppose the big difference between now and then is that there was just there was no real apology in the use of time and sound as a form of exploitation. And of course, the postmodern moment here is that there is at least some recognition that it happened, but it's still a very muted recognition.
Mm. In fact, we have upstairs at the galleries at the moment a work by the Canadian French artist Kapuani Kiwanga, a work that was developed in response to this summer. And it is the central musical phrase of Nina Simone's Mississippi Goddam, in which there's a kind of a slowing down and then this reiteration of the word too slow, too slow. And she invited a group of local musicians in Rotterdam to perform just that phrase in its parts, and she kind of really pulled it apart and distended it and stretched it as a gesture towards trying to hold on to what the rupture of a revolutionary moment was.
Wow.
So it's one that certainly has been felt very closely this year. I also couldn't help but think of the images that you showed us and the conditions of time and labor that you were showing us in relation to what Nada had just shared in terms of a time organized around celebration, a time like a time where the punctuations of time are the moments of rejoicing or the moments of coming together and celebrating. Whereas what you were showing was a puncturing of time with this regimens of clock time and labor, and the contrast between them was one that I found very striking.
Yeah, I'm very curious about the forms of resistance to this westernized, highly calibrated form of clock time. And one of them is to affect this kind of temporal regime on the bodies of the enslaved, that there had to be a host of stereotypes that were deployed aggressively and frequently. And one of those stereotypes was that Black bodies couldn't understand time, that they had to be regimented and taught. And ultimately, when emancipation occurs, when freedom occurs in 1863 to 1865, there is the idea that freed people must be taught time and they must be given watches in order to learn time. But underwriting that was an equally sort of sinister stereotype about something that was called CPT, or colored people's time, which in fact is much more of a global history than people realize. But the idea that African Americans in the American South didn't know time and therefore were always late. But what people didn't realize is that it's precisely because they did know what time was, and that lateness was a form of rejection of this larger surveillance temporality, right? And so there is all sorts of resistance that fixes on time as a way to say, no, I'm going to re-narrate the meaning of time in a way that you will understand, but you will not like. Because one of the problems here, of course, is with the American and British industrial working classes, to resist the very form of capitalist time, they have to become masters and experts in the narration of that form of time. So if you think about the first organized labor, what is it dedicated to? The 8-hour day. Well, the 8-hour day is as fundamentally an acceptance of the legitimacy of that form of time. So in resisting it, there's a profound kind of accommodation that African American enslaved people didn't really go down. They resisted in a slightly different way that I think is much more interesting and perhaps even more powerful.
Well, that's a very powerful, I think, insight to hold on to. As indeed, then perhaps next we invite Raj Kamal. I'm going to share screen and open your set of images. If you'll excuse me for a second, I just need to find how to show it. Perhaps Raj Kamal, while I'm just finding the correct viewing set, you could, I could start up the top and you could perhaps lead off. We need to unmute. Thank you.
Unmute. Okay, now I think we have sound.
Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to thank Mark and Nada because I found both of their presentations very important and made me think about a lot of things that, like on the one hand, this seems to be, my origins. Sorry, my son is yelling now as I've as I've unmuted. My son has started yelling in the other room. Okay. But he stopped. No, I was just thinking two things when Mark was talking. One is that this is really somehow focused on the Americas, tonight's discussion, both in terms of Mark being there, Narda in Bolivia, and then I was born in the US and moved to Germany. But also my reference that I want to talk about tonight has to do with that region of the world. And so there was that. And then the other thing that I found interesting that kind of, I feel like I build off of something that Mark was talking about is somehow the organization of bodies. And for me, the focus really is, I'm sorry, that was my son. This is like classic, I don't know, like Zoom folklore that like everyone gets interrupted by their child or their dog. I don't know. Anyway, but this thing about organization of bodies that Mark was, I'm sorry, Vivian, can you just talk for a few minutes while I try to, because I can't focus at the moment and I can't.
No, so I'm going to stop sharing screen so we can see all of us.
Actually, you know, I forgot that I wanted to share something with you all, and it's the sound of the clock of the South exactly at 1 p.m. today. I asked a friend to record it, so I sent it just now to Irene via WhatsApp.
Oh,
it's like, but let's see if you can hear it, and then we. Can you hear it? That's it. Could you hear it?
yes.
Oh, that's it. Okay, that's it.
Whoa.
Okay. Shall I continue?
Try. Anyway.
Okay. Okay. So, no, it was just that trying to, like what Mark was talking about, the organization of bodies on plantations. For me, I've been thinking a lot about these types of bodies, right? What are the bodies that have become objects of study? And in general, like I have been lately thinking about my work in terms of radical empathy and care. And I'm trying to create relationships of solidarities, of care, of solidarity and care towards men and women that I encounter in the archives. And then for me, in part, this is about making a kind of community with the dead, which is always been for me. It was funny when I first started to be asked to talk about time, it's like I've always been thinking about this kind of what Mark talked about. How is 150 years ago still living today? How is it being represented today? How is it shaping what we are in fact living, and how we are perceived, how we look at each other, and how we how it affects not only how we see ourselves, but how we see each other. And so for me, this is a lot about historical representation and archives. And so a lot of my work deals with that. And today there's this reference that I wanted to mention. I didn't want to read it, but I wanted to just paraphrase this prologue that's in the beginning of David Stannard's book, which is called American Holocaust. And his paraphrasing, my paraphrasing him rather, is that he begins this book on what he calls the post-Columbian Holocaust, right? This is his terminology. And so he starts by describing an early summer morning in 1945, when the first atomic bomb was detonated in the deserts of New Mexico on a US military base that was called the Holy Trinity. And then he also writes that 4.5 centuries earlier, on October 12th in 1492, Columbus landed on San Salvador. And then he marks that both of these moments, the detonation of the first atomic bomb and Columbus landing at San Salvador, that they both mark this culmination of technological achievement for each of their countries, for their nations. And then he also marks that both of those moments mark a level of devastation that was never before seen in human history. And then he goes on to say that, 21 days after the test at Trinity, the first atomic bomb was then dropped on Hiroshima, and 130,000 people were killed in one explosion. And then after that, 21 years after Columbus, he makes this parallel, and that 21 years after Columbus landed in the Caribbean, on the island that he renamed Hispaniola, the island was desolate, that nearly 8 million people that Columbus had called Indians had been killed. And so what that means, what he describes, is that in the span of one generation, or just slightly more than one generation, what happened on Hispaniola or San Salvador was the equivalent of 50 Hiroshimas. And so for me, like, the reason I kind of wanted to use his prologue is, for me, it illustrates a way I've been thinking about history a lot as an artist, but more than just as an artist, to try to make sense of the world that I'm living in. So I'm always thinking about what happened in 1850 or in 1890, and how does a representation that got created then exert influence on my life today. And so in a way, I've been now, just in this discussion, I remembered one of the first talks I gave as an artist in like 2007 at UC Santa Barbara, was titled like, love, and it was called The Side Effects of Time Travel. And I was talking about colonial histories, right? And how these forms of time travel have a kind of emotional cost to them. And I don't know, so these are the kinds of ways that I've been thinking about time, and yeah, I would really be open to talking more. I didn't really want to prepare so much. I just had sort of the images to kind of just kind of as a background of the way I'm dealing with archival materials, historical books. The images that we see right now that are coming up are of women that come out of the book that we saw before, Die Völker der Erde, which is a German anthropology book from 1902. And for me, a lot of the relationship that I'm trying to enact towards the women that I find in the book is one of care and restitution of their dignity and their humanity. And it's, it's a lot about, for me, there is a kind of permeability when we talk about time. It's not about decades, but rather centuries. And I think, going back to Azule in the Potential Histories book, there's a really nice way that she theorizes the everywhere, the anytime and the everywhere that's been impacted by imperialism. And this, and she had a really nice way to say it, which I can't remember, but this idea has been something that I've been working with a lot, because I want to not only think about geographies of colonialism expansively, I want to think also in terms of time in the same way, that we can move and find these connections that historians are looking at, but I think all of us have ways of connecting with these things. So I stopped there.
I mean, certainly one of the things that the quote that Irena gave us at the beginning was from Azule was pointing to the way that the politics of time has historically been aestheticized. And there's been a kind of a very sharp frontier between what is considered cultural heritage and what is considered the innovative realm of contemporary art as well. And it seems that you sort of delve in your artistic practice and your painterly practice, sort of really try to be quite rebellious at that threshold. Yeah.
I try to talk back in a certain way. For me, it's the idea of erasing is not okay. This is goes towards a fascist ideology. For me, it's about going into the archive and going into and basically we cannot erase the history that happened, which is however traumatic, but rather I'm trying to then have a conversation with this history, a dialogue with this history, and then speak back to it in a way, but visually, yeah.
And I think one of the things that your reference at the beginning from this prologue really touched on as well, which is really crucial, is sort of the relation of time and like eventfulness per se, and the relation between like the event and the lag. And the way that sort of, one of the features that's been sort of, I guess, critiqued recently in the last couple of decades has been an overdetermination of time to the event, and trying to look at ways of conceiving time that understand that like an event is like a knot within a fabric of time over, a very, very long period. And also the way that certain things register events as events and don't register as events, which is perhaps in relation to what Mark was talking about as sort of like an impatience for a revolutionary event that's sort of waiting to come, or for the non-recognition of many forms of death that also aren't recognized sort of as events. Yeah, so I found that to be a very powerful and important part of what you'd said there as well.
Yeah, can I piggyback on that? I think you put your finger on it. I think what Raj Kamal is doing is very important because it provides us with an alternative language that's not hostage to the very linguistic tricks of temporality itself. And what I mean by that is it's very difficult to escape the very idioms of expressing what time is, right? So historians are especially challenged on this because we like to talk in terms of decades and centuries, but the very idea of a decade is itself a conceit, right? So you don't really get people in the 1670s calling it the 1670s. They have a different sense of time. I mean, really the idea of a decade is quite a recent invention, at least in terms of a way of measuring time that is universal. And that's true of centuries as well. I mean, people often had alternative ways to express their temporal sense themselves in historical time as well as their own lives that would be alien to us. But it's very difficult for us to critique that because we don't really possess the language for it. We're hostage to the language we're trying to critique. And so what I think what Raj Kamal is doing is giving us an alternative vocabulary to talk back, as she so beautifully put it. I think that's precisely it. And when you say talk back, I think you're really talking about two things. You're talking about a dialogue, but you're also pushing back. You're talking back with a degree of authority that doesn't accept the very terms of the discourse in the first place. Or am I reading too much into this?
No, this is, I mean, it is for me, for instance, in the Cutting Apart the Book, the history book or the anthropology book, on the one hand, it's talking back to the author, to the discipline of anthropology, to German colonialism, and on the broadest sense, without sounding conceitful, to Western knowledge production. But at the same time, it's still the gesture of an angry teenager who's cutting apart their book because they don't like what they're being told to read. So it's like, for me, it's all of those things. And it's also very cathartic and enjoyable to do all of this work, and to be able to articulate these positions. it's a cathartic work too. Joyful for
I
me.
mean, if I could be so greedy as to like share an extra slide, and I know I sort of have too many much like hands on the lever, but there was one that as Irena was doing the introduction sort of suddenly came to mind, that for me is a really crucial reference for this, and that I think sort of talks to some of what the rebelliousness of that practice is, which is an artwork that is, for me, one of the most useful artworks that I know of in existence. This artwork does a huge amount of work in my practice. It's by an artist called Gordon Hookey, who's a Wanyi Indigenous artist from Central Queensland. And so on the top, it says they want our spirituality, but not our political reality. And on the bottom, it says the peddlers of Hooga Booga, the perpetrators and perpetuators of cultural colonialism. And it comes from an Indigenous artistic discourse in Australia in the 90s and the 2000s that was framing Hooga Booga as naming a European desire for what Indigenous artists should be producing. And this is an image that kind of names that, and then in a very militant way declares a refusal of it as well. And so in terms of the work that people like Azule do, or that Fabian do, in terms of the kind of temporal capture that exists in what, Mark, you've said is like even the language of time and culture, which Fabian speaks of in his work when he says there's an anthropological language of like the Wanyi or the people. It's sort of, it's an artwork that is putting its finger in the middle of that matrix. And particularly something that I find useful about this image is that it also names something that's very hard to discuss within secular modernity, which is that there's something mystical or magical or spiritual within this matrix as well. There's like a capture of the spirit that happens within certain configurations of time. And it's been purged within modern languages. It's been purged even within the process of, what was it? A little, what's it called? Where in the Enlightenment, where they kick the spirit out of things? What was it called? Do you remember? Is it like in the Enlightenment and the D, I'm forgetting. But anyway, but it sort of, it speaks back to what, to that part of this structure.
Yeah, I'm also happy. I'll chip in also that we're coming to the topic of sort of resistance, and resistance is temporalities. And also coming back to what Mark mentioned about, the patience that is being said, that is needed in the Black Lives Movement. And this is something that is very powerfully also coming in the book of Ariella Azulay, that this framing of resistance always as a moment, that is also something we should resist, because with that you forget the long line of resistance. Like Black Lives Matter movement, of course, this year we saw it, explode again after George Floyd, but of course this resistance has been going on for hundreds of years, and the way the narrative is made, maybe in resistance, is also in these moments. So that is, I think, a very important factor always to keep in mind, and also something that I'm doubting, when it's very scary also with the pandemic. People are saying it's a new time, but actually it's not a new time. It never is a new time, and we have to watch this. And this is also something for Witte de Wit or Melly, that of course you getting a beautiful new name and you've done it all process, but that doesn't sort of break. It's not a moment of a break in time, actually. It is a continuation of something. And I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind, especially when it comes to resistance. Lara Colley's article in the journal also does that in a way, because she speaks about the museum in resistance, and how museums and this narrative actually kills the resistance, or is intended to kill the resistance. So that's just as an add-on, resistance.
The word I was looking for was disenchantment, by the way. I just remembered.
Yes.
In public. But Yeah, I mean, Narda and Mark, I wonder if you have any further sort of thoughts or comments, so we might move into a bit of a wrap up.
Do you want to go first, Nada?
No, you're on
No,
mute.
Mark, go ahead. Yeah.
I really liked Irene's point there about not accepting the moment as definitive of resistance. And I'm reminded of Martin Luther King Jr.'s 1964 book that was called Why We Can't Wait. And fundamentally, that's the issue, isn't it, really? Because if you reduce all forms of resistance to these moments, these knots in these linear time,
Yes.
which I like that metaphor a lot, then fundamentally what you're really doing is after that moment has passed, you're just inviting people to wait again.
Yes.
Till the next moment.
Yes.
And this is very dangerous because that simply reinscribes the power of linear time. I noticed that the knot is in a rope, right? But it's straight. And it's really worth remembering that some of the origins even of Western time are much more complicated than linear time. I mean, it's really a hoop rolling down a road, right? And we've just lost sight of the hoop, that there is a kind of cyclical quality to this, that, you know, time is more complex than just this linearity that we're presented with and that we accept. Once you recognize and remember that time is multiple, then you're not going to embrace these moments and invest them with so much emotional meaning. And that's a good thing, because that means you don't have to wait for the next moment. It can be a state of perpetual temporal chaos, which in and of itself is not a bad thing.
It involves some very experimental governance structures as an institution, but we're working on it. So watch this space. Nada and Raj Kamal, I wonder if you have any final thoughts or things that have come to mind.
Nada, do you want to?
Well, in general, I was thinking about these forms of resistance and how it has been operating. To me, I wonder if all this wave of decolonization, and it has become like actually a trend in contemporary art and in the academic world. I really hope that there is the mindset needed to decolonize the colonial agenda, because I would like to know to which degree, and it's not a question, it's just rhetorical, to which degree this revisit or of this term and this sudden interest in this subject is going to go to the last consequences, and not only like an academic rhetoric or something that people are just talking about because it's interesting and politically correct. There's just
Thank you for that. So yeah, so when do we, yeah, indeed, again, it's about this, like, it's this waiting game.
I would just, oh, go ahead.
Please, Raj, come on.
No, just that I was going to say the only thing that I would just underscore, because in that would maybe we highlight a bit that connects with what Narda just said and what Mark was saying, but this issue of time and labor, and but then make it more explicit that this is how that's used within capitalism, and to bring that into the conversation with what it means to talk about colonization, extractivism, all of these ideas, how slave labor was organized in the fields. And so, yeah, there's just something that seems often in discussions or in art that remains invisible, which is the economic structure that is underlying institutions like yours, or our, the sale of our work, or the institutions that support us. But so it's this kind of, somehow I would just bring that into the conversation, that somehow this piece about labor somehow and capitalism that is there, but is always somehow invisible in our discussions.
Thank you. Well, thanks, Irena, for bringing together such a wonderful panel of guests this evening for our books. And congratulations on the launch of your journal.
Thank you.
Do you have any final thoughts, maybe as you continue to sort of enjoy the aftermath? Speaking of the event and the lag, I guess we're in the lag of having recently launched the journal, and I wonder how his thoughts continue to percolate for you.
I have many thoughts because I really enjoyed these presentations, and I was also quiet because I enjoy bringing together such different voices with such different expertises. And that's exactly how I would like to move forward. And I think that is very valuable. And I just want to thank the guests very much. And I will keep thinking about a lot of things that have been said. Yeah,
Thanks.
that's basically what I want to say.
Good. So, well, thanks everyone for being here, and for those with us in Zoom and on YouTube and on Facebook and on our website. We have one more books event before the end of the year, which will be December the 17th. Thanks to our supporters, Dream and Dad, for all of our Friday evening events, and to Frame of Frame, to together with Errant Journal, make that possible. Yeah, so I think we cue our outro music now and move into our Friday nights, or our Friday mornings, or our Friday afternoons, or our wherever we are. And yeah, welcome the weekend. So
thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Very nice presentations. Are we alone? Okay.
So thanks again. Yeah, it was really.
No idea.
Yeah.
Okay.
You did that too.